Well, when we are more concerned about how many people we've impacted instead of doing what God has called us to do, I think we're beginning to miss the point. See, we're more concerned, especially in today's day and age, how can I get my message in front of as many people as physically possible? Rather than being focused on, am I doing what God has called me to do? Am I being obedient to what He has called me to do? Because if I'm not, then honestly, I should be more concerned about being obedient to Him. Welcome back to the Sunday to Society podcast. I'm your host, Riley, where we hope you go from the pews to the public square. We release new episodes every Monday on your favorite podcasting apps, such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever else you listen to audio podcasts. You can watch the video version of this podcast on YouTube. And if you haven't already, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or hit that follow button if you're listening to the audio version. Today, I want us to talk about how bigger isn't always necessarily better in ministry and in life. Because I believe it to be human nature to kind of judge things on how big or how grand they are, and then relate that to the quality of whatever it might be. Whether it be a bigger platform, bigger paycheck, bigger house, bigger influence, bigger church, whatever it might be. And really from an early age, we're kind of taught that if it is bigger and it's growing, then it must be working. And that's not necessarily always the case, because sometimes we might be tempted to replace results with obedience. And that's how we measure success, by the results that we're getting based on the outward appearance. However, how does God look at us? And how does God judge success? We see in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, that man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. So does that mean that bigger is going to be better? Not necessarily. Because we could get all the results that we want, but if our heart is in the wrong place, if it is not true growth in the Lord, then it might not be something that is worth the value. It might be something that just isn't always better. And just because it's bigger, it doesn't always going to equate to being better. So let's jump into the episode today by talking about how growth is good, but it's not necessarily everything. And what do I mean by that? Growth isn't evil. Just because you're growing in the Lord, or your ministry is growing, or whatever it might be is growing, that doesn't mean that it's evil. Don't get me wrong. And the numbers that you use to be able to equate that growth aren't meaningless. But when we take numbers and equate them to success, that shouldn't be our goal. Here's an example. Let's say you lead a small group at church, or a Sunday school class, or some sort of group at church, and there's not a lot of people in that particular group. Well, is that group an immediate failure because you don't have a lot of people in that group? Whereas if you look at a different group, maybe even a same church or a church across town, and you notice that that particular group has a lot more people. So is your group a failure and that other group is a success? I would venture to say that that's not necessarily the case. Why do I say something like that? Because numbers aren't everything. What if in that particular small group that you are involved in, or Sunday school class that you are involved in, there's not a lot of people, but there are a lot of deep, meaningful relationships? Whereas the group at the church across town, yeah, there might be a lot of people, but there's really no growth. There's really no depth. And sure, there's a lot of people, but when we really dig deeper into the surface, we see that these relationships, the growth isn't really all there. Then I would ask the question, well, which one would you now define as a success? Maybe it's a volunteer role at church. You're serving in a particular ministry at church, and it might seem like you are unnoticed. Does that mean that your position is any less important than somebody else? I would say no. See, it's not necessarily the size of the ministry. It's not necessarily the how big it could get, but it's really more of the quality. What's the quality like? Real question is, are we faithful to it despite it being small in number or small in group or whatever it might be? I think sometimes we make numbers the goal. And again, there's nothing wrong with setting a goal. We want to see this amount of people. But when we are instead judging and comparing ourselves with numbers to other people rather than the quality, then I think we've missed the point. And when we really begin to dig into this episode, I think we'll see very clearly that Christ isn't necessarily concerned with numbers, but instead he's concerned with quality growth over numbers. Let's look at now how the bigger is better mentality oftentimes shapes everyday Christians. And this really is not just tied to somebody who's in vocational ministry, but it's also tied to somebody who is just your average churchgoer who is in the pews week after week after week. Sometimes we get this idea that the bigger is better mentality when we start measuring impact instead of obedience. We might even be tempted to ask the question, well, is this even worth my time if I'm not impacting as many people as I possibly can? Or are people even noticing me here in this particular ministry? Well, when we are more concerned about how many people we've impacted instead of doing what God has called us to do, I think we're beginning to miss the point. See, we're more concerned, especially in today's day and age, how can I get my message in front of as many people as physically possible? Rather than being focused on, am I doing what God has called me to do? Am I being obedient to what he has called me to do? Because if I'm not, then honestly, I should be more concerned about being obedient to him than the impact that I'm making on other people. Because at the end of the day, let's be honest. Who's going to change lives? You or God? Well, the answer, of course, is going to be God. I'm not going to be able to change anybody's life in and of myself. So why would we be concerned more about the impact on people than the obedience? And I think sometimes the downfall with this can be, if I'm not really making an impact on people and seeing numbers, then I consider myself a failure. Well, Paul in Galatians 6 verse 9 wrote, in due season we shall reap if we faint not. You know what Paul is telling the church of Galatia here? Continue to be faithful because eventually we will reap the harvest. And sometimes we don't always see the impact like we would want to see. We don't always see the growth that we want to see. But what is God concerned about more, results or obedience? Sometimes the bigger is better mentality can sometimes make us feel discouraged by small assignments. We want the big, the grand, the ministry that everybody is going to see. We want those things. We want to impact as many people as we can, but sometimes we might even get discouraged by those small assignments, such as setting up chairs, just showing up consistently, serving in something like a nursery or a ministry where nobody else is going to see us, like cleaning the restrooms during the week or something like that. And sometimes we might get discouraged by those small assignments because they're not the big, the grand, the ministry where everybody's going to see us and everybody's going to congratulate us. We want the bigger ministry. But let's be honest. If we didn't have those small ministries, we didn't have people setting up chairs, we didn't have people serving in ministries, we didn't have people showing up week after week serving in a group, then how more chaotic would churches be? They'd be very chaotic. In fact, they would be so chaotic that it would seem like nothing is ever getting done, and these things would get completely ignored, and then the place would become a mess. Within light of that, now how important are those small assignments? Now we would say those assignments are quite important. And here's the pressure that sometimes culture has placed upon us, that if it's not visible, then it doesn't matter. That if I'm doing a ministry where nobody else sees, where nobody else can take notice, where nobody else can appreciate me, then it must not matter at all. But that can't be further from the truth. While sure, man might not see it, it might not be the grandest ministry, but who does see it? It's God, isn't he? And sometimes God will reward publicly for things that he sees in private. So when you're serving in a ministry that oftentimes might get overlooked or might be a ministry where you might feel discouraged because it seems so small, just know that God sees it, number one, but also numbers, impact, they're not everything. And sometimes we might be tempted to compare our service to what other people have. We might see their platform. We might see their outreach. We might see their impact. And the temptation might be to compare ourselves to them. And when we do that, we're setting ourselves up for failure because it seems like I don't have the platform that this person has. Therefore, I'm not as important as the other person. But maybe that person who has that larger platform isn't necessarily always as faithful as they should be. And their reach might be further, but their responsibilities aren't what they should be either. So do we sometimes fall into this trap of comparing our service to what other people do? And that's the thing. Human nature is we want congratulations from other people. We want a pat on the back, a handshake, an award. We want all of those things based on our accomplishments. But who would you rather be rewarded by? Would you rather be rewarded by Christ, who sees your faithfulness week after week, even if nobody else sees it? Or would you rather have the awards of men who are only going to last temporarily? I know which ones I would pick, but unfortunately, not everybody picks that way. Some people might pick the rewards of men that are only going to last temporarily. So let's look now at some patterns that God has for small, faithful, and sometimes even hidden ministries. The first I want to mention is Gideon. Remember when God has given Gideon a task and he chooses a group of men and he gets whittled down and it gets whittled down and it gets whittled down. And do you remember how many people it ends with? It ends with 300 people. And you think about how those 300 people were used by God rather than the large group that Gideon initially started with. Here's the point to that. God often sometimes looks for the small. He looks for the faithful. And even sometimes when it's hidden, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't trust God any less because he gives us less. Sometimes God will have to bring us down to a position where it seems like nobody else is watching, that nobody else cares, to get us to a place where we might have to rely on him more. And you know what God's looking out for? He's looking out for faithfulness. He's looking out for people who are going to remain faithful to him, even if they're in a position where it seems like nobody else is watching them. Remember when God first comes to Gideon, what is Gideon doing? He's threshing wheat on the floor, kind of in hiding. He wasn't a leader who led a whole group of men from the start. No, he was probably just an average guy. Maybe he was still a teenager. We're not really 100% sure. But through all of this, he continued to stay faithful. Even though he wasn't an anybody, God still chose to use him regardless. Let's look at Christ now. When we see Christ coming to different people, what groups do we see him come to? Yeah, we see Christ come to the 5,000. We see Christ going to these other groups. But many times Christ is going to one person, the one Samaritan woman, the one blind man, the one Zacchaeus, the one man who is lame. We see Christ going to these one people. You think those people's impact was any less than, say, the feeding of the 5,000? Well, no, not at all. In fact, I would venture to say that Christ's impact on those one individual people was far greater than the feeding of the 5,000. Yes, they were all miracles. Yes, they were all Christ's display of power. But I think the personal impact resonated with those one people a whole lot more than the feeding of the 5,000. Luke 19 verse 10 says, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost." Especially with the Samaritan woman, Christ went out of his way to make an impact in her life. She was one person by herself drawing water. Christ goes out of his way to come across her path and ultimately made a lasting impact in her life. He, in fact, decided to have the disciples go into town so that they could find food, so that Christ could have this one-on-one interaction with this lady. Do you think that this lady would have been influenced if the disciples were there with him? I don't think he would have. I don't think the impact would have been as great in her life if Christ and the disciples were there, whereas if it was just Christ like it was, then it was a far greater impact. And we see this happen with Christ over and over and over again in his earthly ministry. We also see this in the early church after Christ descends back up into heaven, and we see in Acts 46, and they continue daily with one accord, that the faith spread through ordinary people. Remember, there's persecution going on in the early church. There are people who are being martyred for their faith, yet faith continues to spread through ordinary people. You think in the early church they could draw huge amounts of crowds like they did at Pentecost day after day after day? No, they couldn't. You know why? Because then suspicion would begin to arise, and then persecution would be even more widespread. They didn't have big grand church meetings like they do today back in the early church. They had to rely on house churches. They had to rely on services of just a handful of people to help avoid distraction, to avoid persecution. So would we call the early church a failure because they couldn't draw large crowds of people? No, in fact, we would call it quite the opposite. We would call it such a success that they were able to spread the gospel across the world very quickly, all because it was done through small amounts of people and faithfulness day in and day out, like it says here in Acts 2:46. So as you can begin to see that just because a ministry or a church is big and grand doesn't mean it's successful. Doesn't mean that God is working in that midst more than somebody who might have a much smaller church or a so much smaller ministry. Next, I want us to look at some of the hidden costs, some of the downfalls and traps that we might be tempted to fall in if we are constantly wanting to chase more. And the first one is this: straight burnout. Sometimes we get this idea that if I just continue to do more, if I just continue to do as much as I can, then build up, that I will be a success. But you know what that ultimately leads to? It ultimately leads to burnout. And instead of doing something well, I just need to take a shotgun approach, just cast out as best as I can to get as many people as I can. And sometimes sacrificing by saying yes, 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 yes to everything so that I can grow, and eventually I'll get to a place of burnout, and then the growth just begins to fizzle out. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." When we come to a place where we rely on God for rest, when we find our rest in Him, rather than chasing after building up and ultimately burning ourselves out, when we rely on God, we'll find out that He will give the increase that we are wanting, that He is wanting ultimately. Sometimes we get this idea that I have to keep going and going and going and building and building and building, and then eventually I get to a spot of burnout, and everything that I have built just crumbles like a house of cards. Here's a reality. If Christ, who is God, 100% God and 100% man, if He had to get away for a little while and to find rest, what makes us think that we're any different? We're not. If Christ Himself had to find rest, what makes us think we don't have to find rest? We do. So it can sometimes lead to burnout, but it can also lead to neglecting what's right in front of us. When we are more concerned about chasing more, building bigger and building bigger, we might be tempted to choosing to ignore our family, our relationships, maybe even our own church community, because we have been focused more on building and building more and more and bigger and bigger and bigger. In 1 Timothy 3, verse 5, when he's talking about the qualifications of a pastor, and he says, now I want you to think about some of the largest ministries, largest churches that you can think of. Now, think about where the families are of the people who are in charge of that ministry. I would say it's probably a good 50-50 that either some of them are still in ministry, whereas some of their families, the other half, don't want anything to do with church whatsoever. It's because sometimes we have gotten to this spot where we have chosen to build and build and build and totally ignored our family, our relationships, and sometimes even our own church community. So I think that's sometimes is the temptation that we might choose to neglect what's right in front of us instead of building and building and building. Here's the thing that somebody told me not long after I got into vocational ministry: never forget your family. Your family is a number one priority. God should be at the top, then your family, then the church. And here's their reasoning why. You can always go find another church. There's always going to be churches who are looking for a vocational staff, but you know what you can't go out and get? Another family. And so when we choose to neglect those things in front of us at the sake of making and building a bigger ministry or a bigger church, I think we've totally missed the point at that. We've also allowed our own pride to creep in and lie to us. And here's the thing. We compare ourselves to ministries across town or across the state or somebody that we follow on social media. We allow ourselves to become prideful and think, well, here's what I have built, or here's what somebody else has built. I want to be like that. I want to build. And if you hear I, and when we do build up something great, it's look what I have built. Look at all the people that follow me. Look at all of these different things. And if we're not careful, we can allow pride to creep in. We might allow pride to subtly take over, and discouragement might come in if it doesn't build up like we think that it should. So these are just some of the hidden costs of chasing more, building more ministry. Here's how God defines success. Not only for people who are in a ministry or lead a group, but just for everyday believers. Here's what biblical success looks like. It looks like obedience when no one else is looking. Think about all of the people in the Bible who still chose to obey God when nobody else was looking. Remember Noah? Noah was given the task to build an ark. And for 120 years, he built the ark faithfully. And he was consistent. You think that Noah didn't ever want to quit building the ark? I bet he did. Odds are good that over the course of 120 years, Noah probably thought about, is this any good? Am I even going to see what God has said he is going to send? And even when the results might be slow, he was still consistent. He was still faithful. And for us, whether we're teaching a Sunday school class, whether we're leading a discipleship class, whether we're leading a church or a group or whatever it might be, are we still consistent even when the results are slow? There's no such thing as a grow a ministry overnight. It's just like there's no such thing as a get rich quick. But are we still consistent even when results are slow? And this could even be applied to our own personal life. Do we continue to read our Bible day in and day out, even when it seems like we don't see drastic change in our life overnight? Colossians 3:23 says this, "And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men." We're not here to please people. We are here to do whatever we are to do, whether how big or how small, heartily as to the Lord, wholeheartedly. And so it's not a question of how many people can I impact, how many people can I add to my group, but instead the question is, am I honoring God where he has placed me? And sometimes the temptation might be, Lord, I'm pretty sure you've placed me in the wrong place. I'm not impacting the amount of people that I feel like I should be impacting. God, I think you made a mistake by placing here. Do you serve a God that makes mistakes? Because I sure don't. And even though we might be in a spot where it seems like God is not growing the ministry or growing the church like we think that he should, just know that he has placed you there for a particular reason. And after all, didn't Christ say, "This rock I will build my church"? It's not your church. It's not your ministry. It's God's. So instead of trying to equate size with significance, shouldn't we instead measure, am I pleasing God? Is my attitude where it should be? Am I where God wants me to be? So as we begin to close this episode, where have you been tempted to try to equate size with significance? It might be something as a discipleship or Bible study with only a handful of people, and you wish that there were more people who would come so you can make more impact and bigger impact on people. But maybe God has chosen not to add to that particular thing because he's trying to teach you something. Is there a spot, a small place where God has entrusted me? Am I willing to serve faithfully, even if it never grows? See, when we get to heaven, we all want to hear the words found in Matthew 25:21, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." That's what we want to hear. Christ is not going to say, "Well done, you built a big ministry and you impacted so many people's life." No, you know what we want to hear Christ say? "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." Christ is not going to judge us on how big or how small our ministry is. He is going to judge us on how faithful we've been to him. Whether that be a ministry that's big and large, whether that be something that's just a handful of people, that's what Christ is going to measure us on. And so I hope the temptation for you isn't to try to build as big of a ministry that you can or impact as many people as you can. Instead, just be faithful where God has placed you, whether how big or how small it is. I hope I've given you some things to think about in this episode. If you haven't already, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or hit that follow button if you're listening to the audio version. You can like us on social media at Sunday to Society on Instagram. You can also like us on our Facebook page at Sunday to Society Podcast over there. I hope you have a great day and God bless.